So what exactly is SIBO yogurt? Well, it's an idea I introduced in my Super Gut book based on the idea that at least half the US population has SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, SIBO, S-I-B-O. Now, why do I say half the population? Well, the evidence is actually quite strong. All you need to do is look at all the studies, dozens of them, that ask this question. In condition blank, fill in the blank, in condition blank, what proportion of people test positive for SIBO, typically using breath, hydrogen gas, and some other methods? That is, microbes can produce hydrogen gas, but you cannot. And so if you feed them something, a fiber, it could be lactulose, could be inulin, and microbes in the upper GI tract will produce hydrogen gas very rapidly because they're in the stomach, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum. Hydrogen gas production in the colon, 24 feet down from your mouth, that's normal, but that takes a while to generate hydrogen gas if you consume something that leads to hydrogen gas production. But if you consume something, say, like inulin, and hydrogen gas is produced within the first 30, 45, 90 minutes or so, you know you have microbes high up in the gastrointestinal tract. SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Now, if we ask that question then, in condition blank, what proportion of people test positive for SIBO using hydrogen gas testing? Well, let's insert irritable bowel syndrome. So there's 60 to 70 million Americans with IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. What proportion test positive? Well, it varies from study to study, but on average about 31%. So 31% of 60 to 70 million, we're talking about 18 to 20 million or so people right there alone. How about obesity? Of the 110, 115 million Americans with obesity, what proportion test positive? About 50%. Likewise, type 2 diabetes. Now go down the list of common chronic conditions. Could be a neurodegenerative disorder like Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer's. It could be a skin condition like rosacea or psoriasis. It could be a sleep disorder, sleep apnea. Could be fibromyalgia. Go down the list and you'll see over and over again a significant proportion of those people test positive for SIBO. Add it all up. Now there's some overlap, right? An obese type 2 diabetic with fatty liver. So there's going to be overlap in these conditions. But you rapidly see we exceed easily 150 million people nationwide who will test positive for SIBO. So we're talking about the worst epidemic in the history of our species. Now, it's not an infectious epidemic, right? It's an epidemic created by modern life, such as exposure to antibiotics, probably exposure to glyphosate, that is an herbicide but also an antibiotic, exposure to other herbicides and pesticide residues in foods, food preservatives that keep microbes from growing in your food but also do so in you, emulsifying agents like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose that disrupt the mucous barrier and change microbial composition of your gastrointestinal tract, on and on and on. We are flooded with factors that disrupt the microbiome. And one of the results of this is an overproliferation in the colon of fecal microbes, where they're supposed to be, but they become overpopulated. These are most of the species of proteobacteria like E. coli, Campylobacter, Citrobacter, Pseudomonas, etc. But remarkably, not only are they overproliferated in the colon, they also ascend into the 24 feet of small intestine. 24 feet of small intestine. Now these microbes, now trillions of them that have infested the small intestine, they don't live very long. Microbes live on the order of about several hours. So you have trillions of microbes living and dying rapidly in the 24 feet of small intestine. Small intestine is very poorly equipped to deal with this. Unlike the colon. The colon is accustomed to dealing with these microbes. Two-layer mucus barrier, much less penetrable. Small intestine, very penetrable. Single-layer mucus barrier, because that's where you're supposed to absorb nutrients, like amino acids, fatty acids, vitamins, minerals. So the small intestine, poorly equipped to deal with these invading fecal microbes. When those microbes die, because of their very short lives, they release their toxic components, but specifically endotoxin and some other things as well, like lipoteichoic acid and some other species, but mostly endotoxin, lipopolysaccharide endotoxin. That's a component of the cell walls of those proteobacteria, E. coli, Campylobacter, etc. that endotoxin enters the bloodstream. That's called endotoxemia. So there's a dramatic rise in the level of endotoxin in the bloodstream. And that's how microbes in the gastrointestinal tract can export their effects and you can experience anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, dementia, Parkinson's disease, rosacea, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, weight gain in the abdomen, obesity, hypertension, atrial fibrillation, coronary disease. In other words, we need to re-examine all we thought we knew about human disease in light of the contribution of SIBO and endotoxemia. Well, how do we correct this situation that applies to at least half the U.S. population? You could take an antibiotic, and that would at least temporarily improve the situation, but recognize that antibiotics are part of the reason we got here in the first place. So I find it hard to believe that an antibiotic is part of the solution, right? So here's my simple rationale that led me down this path of thinking about SIBO yogurt. Well, what if you took a commercial probiotic off the shelf? Would your SIBO go away? Would it kill the trillions of microbes infesting the 24 feet of small intestine? No, it will not. It might improve some things to make it have less bloating, for instance, maybe a little less diarrhea, but it does not completely eradicate or improve the situation. So here's the question I asked when I first conceived this idea of SIBO yogurt. What if we chose microbes to restore that, one, we've lost, two, are known to colonize the small intestine? That's where SIBO occurs, right? And are known to produce what are called bacteriocins, natural antibiotics, peptide antibiotics, effective in killing fecal microbes. So I originally chose three. I chose Lactobacillus rhodori, specific strains of Lactobacillus rhodori, Lactobacillus gasseri. Those two are very good at colonizing the small intestine and producing bacteriocins. Gasseri, for instance, up to 7 different bacteriocins. I originally chose Bacillus coagulans for similar reasons, a spore-forming microbe. But I replaced that with another microbe. The reason for that was when we tried culturing Bacillus coagulans by itself as yogurt, it was kind of inconsistent, a little unreliable. We got wild variation in numbers. It doesn't mean it's not a good microbe, it just means it's not the best, dairy is not the best vehicle for its fermentation. So I replaced it with Bacillus subtilis because it's much more reliable in fermentation, and it's a wonderful producer of bacteriocins. Now, here's another thing. The bacteriocins of rhodori and gasseri are effective in killing most of what are called gram-negative species. These are species that stain in a specific way when you want to see them under a microscope. Bacillus subtilis produces bacteriocins effective in killing both gram-negative and gram-positive. That can be important because what if your SIBO is dominated by gram-positive species? These are species like Staphylococcus, Streptococcus, Enterococcus. So, in other words, SIBO is not one thing. It's many, many, many different things depending on the dominant species involved. Maybe somebody has their SIBO dominated by E. coli and Klebsiella, common. Another person may have it dominated by Staphylococcus and Enterococcus. And so the approach will differ. Well, replacing the Bacillus coagulans with Bacillus subtilis, I think, offers an even wider spectrum of effectiveness. And so far, about 90% of all the people who've engaged in this idea have eradicated their SIBO. That is normalized breath hydrogen gas. Now let's go even further. Let's not just replace those microbes. Let's ferment them with prolonged fermentation. We do that because we get higher microbial counts. So if you did like they do in a factory to make yogurt, now, of course, we call it SIBO yogurt, but it's not the stuff you buy in the store, right? Yogurt in the store is fermented with species like Lactobacillus bulgaricus and Streptococcus thermophilus, kind of ho-hum, boring microbes that really don't do that much for health, and they fermented typically for 6 to 12 hours. Now, microbes don't have sex, right? There's no male and female microbes. They just double themselves, so-called asexual reproduction. So if rhodori, for instance, doubles every 3 hours, you have almost nothing after 6 to 12 hours. Let's let it double 12 times, 36 hours, right? Every 3 hours, 36 hours, 12 doublings. We count the number of microbes using a method called flow cytometry, a laser-assisted method to count microbes. we get around 300 billion with a B, per half cup or 120 milliliter serving. And that's part of the reason why I believe we get these big effects. Prolonged fermentation, much higher microbial counts. In other words, if you've got trillions of invading fecal microbes in your small intestine, you're going to need big numbers. Maybe not trillions, but at least hundreds of billions. And you have greater chances. So far, 90% of people have normalized breath hydrogen gas. Now, you don't have to measure hydrogen gas. You can, using, for instance, the AIR device like this one here, AIRE, from the company Food Marble in Ireland, invented by Dr. Angus Short, who I know, very good guy, smart guy. You can use that device to see whether you have hydrogen gas normalized, but you don't have to. Because if I said to you, the solution for SIBO is something drastic, dramatic, like surgical removal of your small intestine, you would say, well, you better be damn confident this is necessary, right? But what if the solution is something that looks and smells like yogurt that you make in your kitchen? And there's really no adverse effects beyond the initial die-off. When you kill off microbes, you can get a little bit of flu-like symptoms. But beyond those first couple of days or so, what other effects are there? Great effects: smoother skin, reduction of wrinkles, increased libido, restoration of youthful musculature, amplification of the immune response, all the effects that derive from a boost in the hormone oxytocin from the brain, increased generosity, increased desire for human connection, increased acceptance of the people's opinions. In other words, if you get all these benefits, how confident do you have to? You don't have to be confident, right? And you can even use a SIBO yogurt if you don't have SIBO, right? I kind of regret calling it SIBO yogurt because it makes it sound like it's only useful for SIBO. It's not. What we're really doing here is restoring lost keystone species. That is, foundational species that you should have had all along. So important to recognize that you likely lost these species. You probably had them at birth if your mom had them and could pass them on to you with your passage through the birth canal and or breastfeeding or contact. But maybe she didn't have it. She got antibiotics. Or you had it and you lost it because you took antibiotics at age 2 or 5 or whatever, right? So we've lost almost all these species. All we're doing is replacing these important foundational keystone species, but among their effects is small intestinal colonization, bacteriocin production, and you have. Now, you have to consume it for a minimum of 4 weeks. People with really bad SIBO, if you said something like, well, I took antibiotics every day for 4 years for acne or whatever reason, you may have really bad SIBO. You probably have to take the SIBO yogurt for months in order to completely eradicate it. But I would also encourage consumption of the SIBO yogurt intermittently, maybe 3 times a week or something like that, forever. Because all those benefits, skin benefits, and by the way, those are benefits that amount to making you a better human being. Acceptance of other people's opinions, generosity, tolerance, right? Friendliness, love, intensity of love and affection, as well as all those physical effects. Increased musculature, increased libido, increased testosterone in males, increased vaginal moisture in elderly females. I mean, really powerful effects that I think add up to turn the clock back 10 or 20 years. So that's the power of this SIBO yogurt. It's just microbes you've lost that we're restoring that have these wonderful effects, including helping you eradicate SIBO. Now, if you're new to this conversation, how do you get started? Well, I would encourage you to read my Super Gut book, where all these recipes are provided, the rationale, as well as other strategies, other recipes, other ways to manage your microbiome to gain maximum benefit. But you need the microbes, right? So I've made the microbe available as a product I call My Reuteri, available from oxyceutics.com, a company I co-founded. I'll put the link down below. It's a strain of Lactobacillus reuteri that we have tested in animals and in humans to assure that it provides the effects we want. So that I'll put that down below. The Gastrite we don't yet provide for you, so Dr. Joe Mercola has a Mercola marketplace where he provides it as the BioThin product, and that's a source of Lactobacillus gastrite. He got it from the original developers from South Korea, so we used to get it from South Korea, but now you can get it from Dr. Mercola's Mercola marketplace. The Bacillus subtilis, you have 2 choices. You can get it as a DE111 strain from kombuchas. In other words, go to the store and find a kombucha made with Bacillus subtilis. For instance, the Vital Life. I'll put this down below. Vital Life brand that you get from the Aldi's stores for $2.19, a bargain. And you can use that to ferment juices. Make a sparkling juice by fermenting at 90 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 hours. That's one way. Then you consume maybe a quarter, half cup. The juice, of course, starts as a high sugar juice. You need a juice with no preservatives in it, no potassium sorbate or sodium benzoate. You put a quarter, half cup of the kombucha into the juice, cap it lightly. You need to let the carbon dioxide be released, and then ferment 90 degrees Fahrenheit for 60 hours. That's one way to do it, and then consume that as a juice. You can also ferment it as a yogurt, and we use the HU58 strain currently. That's from Microbiome Labs, the company Microbiome Labs, and you can ferment that as yogurt. So now you can co-ferment all three or individually ferment. It's probably best to individually ferment. It's more work, but that way you assure that you have high counts of each microbe. If you co-ferment all three and consume a half cup per day, that does work, but we don't yet know what happens to the relative counts of microbes, let's say at the 5th batch or 10th batch, because microbes compete with each other, and another microbe might dominate after a while, and another microbe might be reduced in count. So we don't know. We have to do DNA testing. We have not yet done that. So if you co-ferment, think about starting again from scratch from probiotic capsules, maybe after your 6th, 7th, 8th batch, so that you're assured of getting all three microbes. Or to stack the odds in your favor, getting high counts of all three, individually ferment them, and consume maybe a third of a cup or so of each every day. So it's very easy. Don't make this harder than it is. It takes a little bit of time, a little bit of cost. You have to buy the microbes. Now, for the most part, remember, you can make future batches from a little bit of the prior batch, except in the case of co-fermentation, where you may have to start again, maybe in some downstream batches. But it should be relatively inexpensive. Now, especially if you do single fermentation of each microbe, just make the next batch from a little of the prior batch. You don't have to buy the microbe again. So it's a very inexpensive way to gain extraordinary, magnificent, powerful advantage in health.